Welcome, everyone, to the Firing the Man podcast. On today's episode, we take a deep dive into my first e-commerce venture that failed and discuss the key lessons and takeaways. We often hear crazy success stories, but often do not hear people talk about their biggest failures. That said, we believe there are some valuable lessons that can be learned from these failures of others, and so that's what we're going to do today, is take a deep dive into a failure of my own. What's going on, Ken?
David, glad to be here in the studio taping another episode. This is a great episode. I think it's a topic that's not discussed often enough, and I think there's so many lessons learned from, trying something and it doesn't succeed and moving on. So yeah, I'm excited to be here, and let's get right into it. So tell us about the business and how you got started.
So this was a woodworking business, and specifically I made wooden cutting boards. I have always liked woodworking, and it wasn't until my wife and I moved out of an apartment into a house where I had a garage that I could actually do some woodworking. And I don't know where I saw it. I think it probably was like a Facebook video or something, but someone was making 3D cutting boards. And which is kind of hard to imagine, but it has a bunch of geometric patterns that makes it look 3D. Ken, you've seen them. We have a couple at my house. And so anyway, I decided I wanted to make some 3D cutting boards. And so just made some on a cheap table saw that I had, and gave them away to family and friends, and got really positive feedback. And it was like my token wedding gift was I would always make a cutting board in my wood shop. And I had a ton of people tell me, you should sell these. These are really good. You should sell these. And every time someone told me that, I probably got a nice little dopamine hit. Felt good about myself. And after enough people told me, I decided, well, I'm gonna make a run at this. I like woodworking in the evenings. It's a nice, relaxing thing to do. So I'm going all in on making cutting boards. And so that's kind of how this all started.
Sure. Nice. So I like that, you started on a business on something that you liked, that you were passionate about, woodworking and stuff like that. So when you started getting those dopamine hits, people were like, oh, you should sell these, you should do that. What did you do? Like, did you get some equipment? What did it take to get this operation up and going?
So this is a pro tip for anybody that is getting married, or anyone that has been married knows this process. Typically, you go and register for gifts, and typically that would be like towels, plates, wine glasses, like things for a house, which makes sense. Like, we've purchased plenty of these items for our friends, but I wanted to. Of course, I knew we were going to get some cash. And so I talked to my wife and said, listen, you can register for whatever you want. I don't even need to be involved in that process. However, I want to earmark $2,500 of cash, and I want to buy myself a table saw with these wedding proceeds. And that was a great compromise, right? She got to register for all kinds of stuff, and I earmarked the first $2,500 of cash for a new table saw. And I'll tell you what, this wasn't any table saw. The brand is called SoStocked. And this is it's just a engineering work of art. It's beautiful. I love my table saw. But the thing that makes SoStocked special is you cannot cut your finger off or anything off. It senses moisture, and like, you can cut through really thick wood all day long, but if you were to try to cut a hot dog on it, which would have like the same consistency of like your finger, the blade stops immediately. And so obviously, like, I make a living with my fingers typing on a keyboard, and table saws can be dangerous. And so my grandpa actually, he didn't lose his thumb on a table saw, but lost it in a piece of machinery. And I've always been sensitive to the fact that I want all 10 of my digits, up top. And so that really appealed to me. And on top of that, it was just like a really high performing table saw. So it probably sounds like I'm sponsored by them. I'm not. I paid full price, but SoStocked, if you're out there, hit us up. So anyway, we got married. I earmarked $2,500, went out and bought a table saw. And then I went and bought some other just nice tools. So it was a router and a table and a sander. So I would say, like, in terms of equipment that I needed, about $3,000 is what I spent. And so, not a huge upfront cost. I still own all of those items and, enjoy using them today. So it wasn't a total loss, but anyway, that was kind of how I got started.
Okay, excellent. And yeah, I have heard of that table saw or that saw brand, and I've seen some YouTube videos. That stuff's pretty incredible. How the blade just kind of stops right there. So that's awesome. So now that you have your equipment, you got the wood shop set up, you got clearance, to make these cutting boards. How long does it take to make each board, and what was your the business sense behind it, profit margins, things like that?
So the biggest investment on these cutting boards was time. And to make a 3D cutting board, typically the process that you follow is you cut all of your wood, different species of wood, which gives different colors, and then you glue them together. Then you got to wait 24 hours. And once the glue's dried, you run it through a planer, get it nice and smooth, and then you make a series of more angled cuts and glue it together and wait 24 hours. And then on some of like my really high-end boards, I would repeat this process a third time. So there would be 3 production days just to make one board. Now, I wasn't making one at a time. I would make 10 of one pattern at a time, which cut down on the total time per board, right? I didn't have as much setup time, but it took a lot. I figured it was about 4 hours per board from the time I counted all of my cutting, all of my sanding, planing. And so the general business model that I followed was it would take about 4 hours to make one board, and I was selling these for about $100 a piece. I mean, they were nice. It was a high-end cutting board, and so after all of my supplies, I was making about $40 profit per board. So in a roundabout way, I was paying myself $10 per hour, which is not bad. I've spent a ton of time woodworking for free. It's a hobby of mine, and so that low dollar per hour wage initially wasn't really surprising to me, but it just, my goal was to fire the man, and this was very early on. But I thought to myself, if I could do woodworking full time, people always say, like, if you do what you love, you'll never work a day in your life. And so I was thinking, if I could, I would be happy to make a little less, but if I could do woodworking all day, this would be awesome. And so now I didn't map out that $40 per board, what it would take to fire the man. And that was a key mistake. And so, which let me just dive right into this. So I was working a full-time job at the CPA firm. I had about 2 hours per evening that I could dedicate to making these cutting boards. And I figured, in a given year, I may have 250 free evenings that I could go out after my wife went to bed and do some woodworking. And I was making $10 an hour. And it was at that point that I did this math and realized, oh, this only adds up to $5,000 annually. To where I realized, okay, this is a good way to maybe earn a little additional money on the side or pay for tools. But this is not a long-term feasible activity to fire the man. And so that was a incredibly valuable lesson early on. And I would people that are thinking about self-manufacturing, I would think about this very early on, is how long does it take to make it? What's your profit margin? And, given all of your other commitments, how many of these could you make a year? And what's that look like from a profit standpoint? And if it's nowhere close to replacing your salary or meeting your financial requirements, great hobby, not great career. I mean, and I hate to say that, but it's not.
Yeah. I would definitely like to stop here and make a point of exactly what you just said, David. I've met a lot of people that bring me ideas, and or someone that has a hobby that they're like, oh, I can do this and make all this money and quit my job, and you just highlighted the perfect scenario. So making these cutting boards is something you enjoyed, right? And you liked it, and it was profitable, but at some point in time, and it was likely that you're an experienced CPA, and so in your head you thought, what the heck, this is not scalable. The math doesn't work out, and so you decided, hey, I can't do this. It's not scalable, and it's not going to get me to my goal of replacing my income to be a full-time business. And so that is something that anybody that has a side hustle, or that not only a side hustle, but a hobby, something you enjoy. And I think when you get emotions into business, it's to the detriment of yourself, your time. And so you really need to maybe take a step back if it's a hobby and you enjoy it, but it's not producing enough cash or it's not scaling. You have to make that decision. Okay, I can't do this anymore, or it's not a feasible business. I can't scale it to accomplish of quitting my job. So maybe just table it, or say, hey, this is my hobby. I truly enjoy it. I'm going to do this, whatever. But definitely, I mean, that was a great point where you bring up, like, hey, you saw the numbers, you saw the math, and you were like, it doesn't work out. This is not going to accomplish me quitting my job. It's not scalable. So, excellent.
One thing I want to add to that, and you brought up the point of like having fun, and that is something I want to talk about that a little bit. So if I think about what I like about woodworking, typically it is that everyone's in bed. It's David time, right? I can just go out to my wood shop and work on whatever I want to, and I like that. I can work on cool projects. I've got really no deadlines. Like I've got a number of like cutting boards. For instance, I'm going to a wedding in 2 months, and shout out Joe Kelly, you're going to get a sweet cutting board. And so I know, okay, I've got 2 months to finish this. There's no rush. And so, and I'm loving this process of building this. But immediately when I switched over to the business mindset to where I was going to commercially produce these, it was no longer woodworking at my leisure. It was woodworking to meet certain deadlines. And so what happened was I would get home from work, and I would have a couple orders that I needed to fulfill. And I told you about that production time, being 3 days, and so it was actually turning into an additional job. And I didn't like woodworking as much. And so I've noticed, like, since I've taken a step away from this company, I've fallen back in love with woodworking. But it was kind of a grind. And the other thing that I'd say is, like, I was not working on purely what I wanted to work on. I was working on what was being ordered. And so, like, I had this one board that was plain. It was just striped. And it was easy to make. It didn't really challenge me in any way. But it was a lower price point, and it sold like hotcakes. And, like, some of my higher-end boards that sell for, like, $200, which I loved making, they didn't sell very often. And so I found myself stuck making the same thing over and over that I didn't really enjoy making. And so, anyway, that was something that, the fun piece of it is, if you're thinking about taking one of your hobbies and turning it into a business, think about, like, would this still be fun to me if I had demands of other people, if I had orders to fulfill, if I had, external pressures? Because oftentimes, like, external pressures don't exist in your hobbies. You just kind of do them at your leisure, right? That's why they're a hobby. And so, anyway, that's kind of I kind of went off the path here, but I'm glad that you brought that up.
Sure. No, absolutely. So to kind of center back here, whenever we try a new project or a new business idea and it doesn't work out, I learn more from that than I do when I try something and it works, right? So let's can you run through some of your lessons learned for this business?
Absolutely. So the first lesson that I learned was, just because you can do a good job manufacturing doesn't mean that you should. This is essential to this story is that I was good at manufacturing. I am good at making cutting boards. But I think that my time would have been better spent working on the business and not in the business. And we say that all the time on this podcast. And when you're doing your own manufacturing, you're really working in the business. And so, not to say that you shouldn't work in the business sometimes, but I do think that was a key takeaway. The second thing was to do a proof of concept much earlier in the process. For instance, I probably had made and sold over 100 boards, cutting boards, over the course of like 3 or 4 months before I ever did that math of 2 hours per evening, 250 evenings, and $10 per hour. And I'm a CPA, which is embarrassing, really. Really, after my first cutting board, I could have timed how long it took me. I could have figured out what my material cost was. Certainly after my first one, I could, build in some, efficiencies gained after I make a lot of these. But I would have known, after my first board that this is a $10 an hour activity. And so I think that would have, had I done that proof of concept and a little bit of mental math early on, that would have really helped me probably not dive all in on this, and probably would have kept it as a hobby. Because when I got into it, man, I was thinking about making 6 figures selling cutting boards, and if I were to do it full time, there literally would not be enough hours in the day. If I was just making cutting boards and sleeping, I could not have made this work. And so, anyway, that's proof of concept. Huge lesson learned. The third lesson that I learned was, if your goal is to fire the man, get a good understanding of how much annual cash flow you're going to need, or even monthly cash flow or weekly cash flow. But that's going to allow you to back into the feasibility, right? And I think that plays an important part in the proof of concept. So, if you know that you need $60,000 a year, and you're making $10 an hour, you better have a lot of free time, right? To where you can dedicate to the side hustle. Because it's just not, it's hard to replace that $60,000, especially when you're working a full-time job. And so, my goal at that time, was to fire the man, to quit my full-time job. And had I kind of done this mental math earlier, I would have been a lot better off. And one final lesson that I learned is if you have a hobby, like, really drill down into what you like about it. And, using this example of cutting boards, obviously I really liked making a beautiful product that would stand up for a long time and be durable. That was probably half of it. But the other half that I loved was giving it to family members and friends. And it just, as a gift, or, just giving it to them. I loved that. And it would be really cool, a couple months later, to go back to their house and it's presented like they have it on their counter, like as a decoration, or they have it above their cabinet. It just like brought me a sense of pride. And so that's what I liked about it. Now, in a customer-facing environment, you strip away half of that enjoyment. So, right, you're no longer giving away your products. Generally, you don't know your customers. You're not going to see them. You're not going to go to their house and see the cutting board on their island. And so all of a sudden, half of what I like about this whole process disappears. And, I didn't think about that on the front end, but that was a really valuable lesson learned.
Yeah, absolutely. So, those are great lessons learned. And thanks for sharing, because, you often hear about, everyone's success stories, but hearing about, times when you struggle and what you've learned to improve and move on, and that's really valuable. So David, knowing what you do now, do you think you could have made this? Do you think you could make this business successful now?
I do, and I've intentionally chosen not to, just to kind of protect this hobby. It's something that I love to do, but there are definitely things that I would have done differently. And the first thing starts with this self-manufacturing. So what I could have done is made a really sweet cutting board that was like a really nice end product and documented the process. And then taken it to somebody, perhaps a retired woodworker, that would be happy to work for $10 an hour. That works in his shop for free every day. So $10 an hour would be great. I could have like outsourced manufacturing, and I think that would have been allowed me to continue to work on my business, not in my business, but to the extent that we were like launching a new product, I still could have been in the wood shop, like creating prototypes and doing what I actually like to do, which is the creative part of this. And so I think that was, if you start off self-manufacturing, it doesn't mean you need to end self-manufacturing. You can make that pivot. And I think in a lot of ways, you may be at an advantage because when you self-manufacture, you see all your mistakes. And when you get products back from a supplier, you're sensitive to those mistakes. You know where they generally appear. And so that was one thing I probably would do differently. The other thing that I would do is I would have just priced my boards higher. What I did was I made some really nice 3D ones that weren't selling, and so I started creating lower priced boards that were easier to make, and those margins were generally like tighter margins. And so I've heard someone talk about, there's this tattoo artist out in LA. He's got like a 4-year backlog, and he's super expensive. And one thing that's unique about him is you don't choose the art, he chooses the art. You just sign up with him, and then he'll tattoo you. And if you look at that business model, he prices his services incredibly high. He only does really high quality stuff. So, for instance, if you wanted 3-leaf clover or something like very basic, he would not do it. He does not have a low price point option. It's only high price point. And so that would have been a move I would have made differently. Is I would not have introduced the lower price boards. I would have just stuck to my guns and stuck with the higher end. One, because that's what I like to do, and two, they definitely have a higher profit margin. So, and then the last thing that I would have done is I would have looked for cheaper materials, which in this case would be wood. I was just buying from a local supplier. I wasn't buying in great enough quantities to, buy an entire truckload of wood. But after the fact, I have found lower cost suppliers, and I would have shopped around. And I think, like, to our listeners, if you have an active supplier relationship, it doesn't hurt every so often to see what else is out there. Because you may find a cheaper option with the same or better quality. And so, I had my one place that I went to get wood, and I just never deviated from that. And so, and that was my biggest input cost, was, aside from my labor, was the materials.
Sure. So to kind of wrap this up, that business venture that he started wasn't super successful. The classic question is, if you had it to do over again, would you?
Absolutely. In total, I probably lost a couple $1,000 in this business. However, I would say I probably learned somewhere between like $25,000 and $50,000 worth of lessons, which have paid dividends in other businesses that I've started. And so that's one thing that, at meetups, people will say, like, what if it doesn't work, or what if I fail? I can guarantee you will get something out of the process. And, like, I'm glad that I had this failure because I got all of those lessons. And I can tell you, when you learn a tough lesson firsthand, it sticks. It has some real sticking power. And so, yeah, I absolutely would have done this. If I could go back in time, I would have repeated this. I don't view it as a mistake. I view it as just part of my windy path to where I am right now. And so I would say, don't shoot for failure, but if it happens, embrace it and take away some lessons, because what's happened has happened. It's in the past. and all you can do is move forward.
Yeah, absolutely. I really appreciate you, sharing this, your experience, this business venture with the audience. I've learned from it. I hope everybody else that listens learns something from this. It's not often that people share their failures or their mistakes or lessons learned, and it's truly valuable. For any of the listeners out there, if you have a story that you want to share with a business venture that failed, hit us up, shoot us an email. We'll get you on the show to share your story, because I think it's very valuable. Support at firingtheman.com. Thanks everybody for tuning in today. We're out.